Ladies and gentlemen, hello, how are you? This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. And today we're going to read a short story by Guy de Maupassant called A Duel. Very exciting story. Short story translated by Roger Collette. Roger Collette does the translations we read when we read Guy de Maupassant. You ready? By the way, enjoy. A Duel. Let's get this screen up a little bit, a little higher resolution. The war was over. The Germans had occupied France, and the country lay quivering like a defeated wrestler under his opponent's knee. The first trains from the famished, suffering, despairing capital were making their way to the new frontiers, crawling along the countryside and through the villages. The first travelers were looking out the windows at the ravaged plains and the burnt-out hamlets. At the door of every house that was still standing, Prussian soldiers in black helmets and with brass spikes were sitting aside chairs, smoking their pipes. Others were chatting or doing odd jobs as if they were members of the family. Whenever a train passed through a town, the passengers could see whole regiments drilling in the main square. And in spite of the rumble of the wheels, hoarse words of command could be heard now and then. Monsieur Dubuis, who had served in the National Guard throughout the siege of Paris, was on his way to Switzerland to join his wife and daughter, whom he had prudently sent abroad before the invasion. And neither hunger nor hardship had reduced his potbelly, the belly of a well-to-do, peace-loving tradesman. He had endured the terrible events of the past few months with the sorrowful resignation and bitter comments on the inhumanity of man. And although he had done his duty on the ramparts and had mounted guard on many a cold night, it was only now, when the war was over and he was approaching the frontier, that he caught his first sight of some Prussians. He stared with mingled fear and irritation at these armed and bearded foreigners who had made themselves at home on the soil of France, and he felt in his heart a sort of fever of helpless patriotism, and at the same time that instinct of self-preservation, that newly acquired sense of prudence, which has never left us since. In the same compartment were two Englishmen who had come to France as sightseers and who looked at everything with calm, inquisitive eyes. And they were both very stout, too. And they chatted together in their own language, occasionally referring to their guidebook and reading out extracts aloud while trying to identify the places mentioned. The train stopped at the station of a little town, and suddenly a Prussian officer climbed the two steps into the carriage, and with a great clanking of his sword. He was a tall man, dressed in a tight-fitting uniform with flaming red beard up to his eyes. His face was cut in half by a pair of long mustachios, paler in color, which stuck out on either side. The Englishman promptly began examining him with smiles of gratified curiosity, while Monsieur Dubuis pretended to be reading a newspaper. He sat huddled in his corner like a thief faced with a policeman. The train moved off again. The Englishmen went on chatting and looking for the exact positions of different battles. And all of a sudden, as one of them was pointing to a village on the horizon, the Prussian officer stretched out his long legs, leaned back in his seat, and said in very Teutonic French, "I killed 12 Frenchmen in that village. I took over 100 prisoners." The Englishman's interest was immediately aroused, and they asked, "Oh, really? What was the name of the village?" "Farsburg," replied the Prussian. And he went on, "I took those French rogues by the ears." and he looked at Monsieur Dubuis, laughing proudly in his whiskers. The train crawled on, passing through more and more occupied hamlets. German soldiers could be seen on the roads, on the outskirts of the meadows, standing by gates, or chatting outside cafes. They covered the earth like African locusts. The officer stretched out his hand. If I had been in command, I would have taken Paris. I would have burned everything, killed everybody. No more France. Out of politeness, the Englishman replied simply, "Oh, really?" He went on. In another 20 years, the whole of Europe, every bit of it, will belong to us. Prussia is stronger than all the rest. The Englishmen, now feeling a little uneasy, made no further reply, and their faces had become expressionless, and they looked like wax masks between their long side whiskers. And then the Prussian officer burst out laughing, and still lying back in his seat, he sneered at France and insulted the prostrate foe. He sneered at Austria, defeated a few years before, and he sneered at the fierce but futile defense put up by the provinces, at the French militia, at the ineffectual artillery. He declared that Bismarck was going to build a city of iron with the captured guns, and suddenly he pushed his boots up against the thigh of Monsieur Dubuis, who flushed to the roots of his hair and looked away. The Englishmen seemed to have become oblivious to everything, as if they had suddenly found themselves shut up within the confines of their island, far from the din and the clamor of the world. The officer took out his pipe, and looking straight at the Frenchman, said, "Pardon me, said, have you any tobacco on you?" "No, monsieur," replied Monsieur Dubuis. The German went on. "Well, then go and buy some when the train stops," he added with a laugh. "I'll give you a tip." The train whistled and slowed down. It passed the burnt-out buildings of a station and came to a stop. The German opened the door, took Monsieur Dubuis by the arm. "Go! Do what I told you," he said, "and be quick about it." The station was occupied by a detachment of Prussian troops. There were more soldiers standing behind the wooden barriers looking on. Monsieur Dubuis jumped down to the platform, and despite the gesticulations of the station master, clambered into the next compartment. He was alone. His heart was pounding so wildly that he had to unbutton his waistcoat, and he mopped his forehead, panting for breath. The train stopped again at another station, and suddenly the officer appeared at the door and entered the compartment, followed by the two Englishmen who were actuated by curiosity. The German sat down, and the Frenchman, and still laughing, he said, "So, you refused to do as I told you?" "Yes, monsieur," replied Monsieur Dubuis. The train moved off again. "I'm going to cut off your mustache," said the officer, "to fill my pipe." And he stretched out his hand towards the Frenchman's face. The Englishman, as impassive as ever, watched intently. The German had already caught hold of the mustache and was pulling at it when Monsieur Dubuis struck by his arm with the back of his hand and, seizing him by the collar, flung him down on the seat. And then, mad with rage, his temples swollen and his eyes suffused with blood, throttling the Prussian with one hand, he started punching him furiously in the face with the other. And the Prussian struggled wildly, trying to draw his sword and to get a grip on his adversary, who was lying right on top of him. But Monsieur Dubuis pinned him down with his huge bulk of his belly, and he went on punching him without pausing to draw breath, and without knowing where his blows were falling. Blood flowed freely, while the German, choking and gasping for breath, spat out broken teeth, and struggled in vain to shake off the infuriated fat man who was pummeling him. The Englishmen had stood up and drawn nearer to get a better view. They stood watching, full of delighted curiosity, ready to lay a bet on one or the other of the combatants. And then all of a sudden, exhausted by his exertions, Monsieur de Bouet stood up and resumed his seat without saying a word. The Prussian was too astonished, too numb with astonishment and pain, to fling himself upon his adversary. And when he had gotten his breath back, he said, "Either you give me satisfaction in a pistol duel, or I will kill you. I shall kill you." Monsieur de Bouet replied, "Whenever you wish." "We are coming into Strasbourg," the German continued. "I will find 2 other officers to be my seconds. There we will just have enough time before the train leaves again." Monsieur de Bouet, who was puffing as hard as an engine, said to the Englishman, Will you act as my seconds?" They both replied at the same time, "Oh, yes!" And the train stopped. In less than a minute, the Prussian had found 2 brother officers who fetched a pair of pistols, and they went off for the ramparts. The Englishmen, worried in case they should miss the train, kept pulling out their watches, quickening their pace, speeding up the preparations. Monsieur de Bouet had never held a pistol in his life. He was positioned 20 paces from his opponent, and then he was asked, "Are you ready?" As he was replying, "Yes, monsieur," he noticed that one of the Englishmen had opened his umbrella to protect himself from the sun. A voice gave the word of command, "Fire!" Monsieur de Bouet fired straight away and without wanting to take aim, and was amazed to see the Prussian standing in front of him stagger, throw up his arms, and fall forward on his face. He had killed him. "I say!" exclaimed one of the Englishmen in a quivering voice with delight, gratified curiosity, and joyful impatience. His companion, who still held his watch in his hand, seized Monsieur de Bouet by the arm and hurried him off at a run in the direction of the station. The first Englishman marked time as they ran along, his fists clenched and his elbows tucked in his sides. 1, 2, 1, 2. All 3 trotted along in line, regardless of their paunches, like 3 grotesque figures in a comic paper. The train was just moving off, and they jumped into their carriage. The Englishmen took off their traveling caps, waved them in the air, and shouted 3 times, "Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" And then one after the other, they solemnly shook hands with Monsieur de Bouet, and they sat down again, side by side, in their corner of the compartment. Wow. Learn more about Guy de Maupassant by watching our analysis of A Duel, this story, and reading and ongoing videos of Maupassant stories on this website. There's many Maupassant stories on this website because Jimmy considers them classics. And be sure to visit and read other classics. So we're going to read the analysis of the story when you get a chance, and then read other classics. We have many, many, many of them, like Lysistrata, Hamlet. And remember, if you have questions, email me, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Wasn't that a wonderful story? Thank you very much for stopping by. See you soon.